Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate this opportunity to have this discussion regarding our bill on mergers and acquisitions. Mr. Chairman, as more and more baby boomers retire, it's been estimated that approximately $10 trillion, with a T, $10 trillion of privately owned, small and mostly family-run businesses will either be closed or, if possible, sold to a new generation of entrepreneurs in the coming years. Mergers and acquisitions, brokers, M&A brokers, play a critical role in facilitating the transfer of ownership of these smaller, privately held companies. However, today's one-size-fits-all system of broker-dealer regulation unnecessarily burdens business sellers and buyers with the pass-through of heavy regulatory compliance costs that do not provide significant incremental benefits in privately negotiated M&A transactions. Today, federal securities regulations require an M&A broker to be registered and regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission and FINRA, just like Wall Street investment bankers selling or buying publicly traded companies. That's right, anyone brokering the sale of a hometown business in your district must be federally registered and regulated as a securities dealer broker, in addition to state law requirements regardless of the size of the business or the sale transaction. Federal securities regulation was primarily designed to protect passive investors and public securities markets. Privately negotiated M&A transactions facilitated by these small business brokers are vastly different and are not typically related to the transactions meant to be protected through the SEC and FINRA registration and regulation. That is why I've continued to introduce bipartisan legislation known as the Small Business Mergers, Acquisitions, Sales, and Brokerage Simplification Act. This bipartisan bill would create a simplified system for brokers performing services in connection with the transfer of ownership of these smaller, privately held companies. The changes proposed in this bill, H.R. 477, would specifically apply to M&A transactions involving the sale of privately owned businesses with annual earnings of less than $25 million, that is earnings before interest, taxes, depreciation, amortization, commonly known as EBITDA, or annual gross revenue of less than $250 million. Now, there's been some discussion about why particularly these numbers. Well, it fits for various industries. For example, if you are in the grocery industry, you're going to have very high sales with a very low margin of profit. If you own a jewelry store, you're going to have the opposite. You may have very low number of sales, but a high profit margin. So that's why we had that, we actually mimicked that those numbers. H.R. 477 would only apply where the buyer will directly or indirectly control and actively manage the businesses after the transaction closes. Let me read that again. This is going to apply only to people who are going to be indirectly involved with their businesses. This is not passive investing, this is active investing. Transactions where the buyer acquires control and then actively manages the businesses are entirely different from capital-raising transactions involving passive investors. The regulatory structure regarding these types of M&A transactions should reflect that. Additionally, the investor protection provisions included in my legislation disqualify bad actors and, quote, public shell companies, and those companies would then be excluded from these mergers. The impact of this legislation would be meaningful by reducing transaction costs, promoting competition among small business brokers, and facilitating private business merger, acquisitions, and sales of small businesses. This small business initiative promotes economic growth and development through business sales, jobs creation, and preservation, and provides important, immediate, and substantial relief of regulatory burdens on small business professionals who serve smaller business owners. Business brokerage services are critically important to entrepreneurs that start, build, and eventually want to sell their private enterprises. Similarly, these services help new entrepreneurs acquire businesses while helping existing companies grow, thus preserving and creating jobs in the communities that we all serve. In today's highly charged political environment, it's nice to show the American people that positive, effective initiatives can be considered and passed with strong bipartisan support. In fact, similar legislation has overwhelmingly passed both the Financial Services Committee and the full House of Representatives during the last two Congresses. It's legislation like H.R. 477 that demonstrates Congress can act in a bipartisan manner to positively impact the lives of Americans. I urge swift consideration and passage of this important bill. With that, I yield back.